Welcome to my YouTube channel, one of the most disturbing cases in the recorded history of Tennessee. Before we get started, I invite you to leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and the exact time you first came across this story. We're curious to find out where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts are reaching our viewers. The Cumberland Plateau holds its secrets in a hollow kind of silence. In the spring of 1911, the small mining community of Wilder, Tennessee, tucked between the region's rugged mountains and dense forests, became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing series of events ever documented in the state's history. What started as a routine labor dispute at the coal mines would soon spiral into something far darker. A shadow that would echo across generations and leave a lasting mark on those who survived to tell the story. Before we dive into the heart of this disturbing narrative, it's important to understand the context of the time. The early 1900s marked a period of significant industrial growth across America, especially in areas rich with natural resources. The Cumberland Plateau, with its abundant coal deposits, drew in numerous mining operations. These companies often built entire communities around their mines, creating isolated pockets of civilization where the company controlled nearly every part of daily life. Wilder was one such community. Founded in 1887 by the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company, the town existed mainly to serve the mining operation. By 1910, its population had grown to nearly 800 people, most of whom either worked for the mine or provided services to those who did. The company owned the general store, the boarding houses, and even the church building. Miners were paid in scrip rather than U.S. currency, tokens that could only be used at company-owned establishments, effectively binding the workers to the company in a form of economic servitude. Frederick Wilcox, the owner of the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company, was known across the region as a shrewd businessman with political connections reaching all the way to the state capitol in Nashville. Unlike many mine owners of the era who kept their distance from their operations, Wilcox maintained a residence in Wilder, a Victorian mansion set apart from the modest miners' cabins, a clear symbol of the stark class divisions that defined the community. It was into this environment that Thomas Simmons arrived in 1901, initially hired as an accountant for the mining operation. What few knew at the time was Simmons's background in medicine. According to records later uncovered from Vanderbilt University, Simmons had completed 3 years of medical training before abruptly withdrawing from the program in 1899. His academic file contains a cryptic note from the Dean of Medicine stating, "Mr. Simmons's departure is mutually agreed upon following concerns regarding his unorthodox research interests and experimental methodology." The Simmons family homestead stood at the edge of Wilder, a weathered 2-story structure built in the 1880s, its timber frame creaking with every gust of wind that swept through the valley. Thomas Simmons, eventually promoted to mine foreman, had lived there with his wife Margaret for nearly 10 years by 1911. By all accounts, they were upstanding members of the community, regular churchgoers, hospitable neighbors, and familiar faces at local gatherings. Thomas was known for treating the miners under his supervision fairly, a rarity in those harsh times of labor exploitation. Ezekiel Johnson, who worked as a miner in Wilder from 1903 until 1916, recalled in a 1957 oral history, "Simmons wasn't like the other bosses. He treated us with respect, asked after our families. He had this way of listening that made you feel like he was genuinely interested. But there was something about his eyes that wasn't quite right, like he was studying you the way a scientist might examine a specimen. It didn't feel malicious exactly, just different." Margaret Simmons, by contrast, was remembered as warm and gregarious, though several accounts mention her becoming increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to the couple's disappearance. She had arrived in Wilder as a new bride in 1901, the daughter of a Nashville physician with connections to Vanderbilt University. According to church records, she taught Sunday school and organized a women's literary society that met weekly in the Simmons home. Yet, according to county records obtained decades later, there were discrepancies in the official narrative surrounding the family. Employment logs from the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company showed that Thomas had been briefly dismissed in 1909, only to be rehired 6 months later with a promotion. No reason was documented for either the dismissal or the subsequent favorable treatment. When interviewed in 1962, former company secretary Eliza Watkins noted, there were whispers about Simmons having leverage over Mr. Wilcox, the mine owner. Something about knowledge that wasn't meant to be shared. During his 6-month absence from the company, Simmons's whereabouts remained a mystery to the townsfolk. However, travel records from the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, uncovered during a 1970 historical survey, showed that during this period, he purchased tickets to Chicago, New York, and Boston, all cities with prominent medical research institutions. What business Simmons conducted in these locations remains unknown, but upon his return to Wilder, witnesses reported multiple deliveries of large, heavy crates to the Simmons residence. The winter of 1910 to 1911 had been particularly harsh in Tennessee. Heavy snowfall had isolated many communities, and Wilder was no exception. Food supplies dwindled, tensions rose among the miners as wages were cut while working hours increased, and the company's store raised prices, driving many families deeper into debt. According to local newspaper archives, it was during this period that the first disappearances were noted, not reported as such, but rather mentioned in passing. James Farley has not been seen at his post for 3 days, read a small notice in the Wilder Weekly Chronicle from January 23, 1911. Similar notices followed for 2 other miners in February. What these brief notices failed to capture was the unusual pattern of the disappearances, according to a private journal kept by Dr. Morris Lieberman, the company physician. All 3 missing men had recently visited him with identical complaints, severe headaches, insomnia, and what they described as sounds that shouldn't be there. Dr. Lieberman's journal entry from February 8, 1911, reads, "Third case this month presenting with identical neurological symptoms. No physical cause evident. All 3 men worked in the new shaft, the one extending beneath the north ridge. Curious coincidence. Mentioned my observations to Mr. Wilcox, who seemed oddly unsurprised and suggested exhaustion as the likely culprit. I remain unconvinced." A report filed by the local sheriff's office, discovered in 1960 during a routine archiving of county records, indicated that Deputy Sheriff Landon Parker had conducted a cursory investigation into Farley's absence. His notes mentioned visiting Farley's small cabin on the outskirts of Wilder, finding it in good order, though with a peculiar odor I cannot place. The deputy concluded that Farley had likely moved on to seek employment elsewhere, a common occurrence during those difficult economic times. What Deputy Parker failed to include in his official report, but later confided to his grandson, according to a 1963 oral history project conducted by Vanderbilt University, was that he had found Farley's most prized possessions still in the cabin, a pocket watch inherited from his father and a pair of new work boots he had saved months to purchase. No man, especially one of modest means, would voluntarily leave such items behind. The grandson's account continues with a detail never officially recorded. Grandfather said he found a strange drawing pinned to the wall behind Farley's bed. It showed what looked like a network of tunnels, but with unusual symbols at various intersections. When he showed it to the mine superintendent, the man turned white as a sheet and snatched the paper away, saying it was company property. The next day, Grandfather found himself removed from the case with explicit instructions from the sheriff to leave company business to the company. By late February, as the harsh winter showed no signs of relenting, an atmosphere of unease had settled over Wilder. The mining company's ledgers, partially preserved in the state archives, show a marked increase in workplace accidents during this period. Miners reported unusual sounds echoing through the deeper shafts, sounds that some described as mechanical and others as almost like whispering. Company physician Dr. Howard Blackwood documented an increase in miners reporting symptoms of nervous exhaustion and disturbed sleep patterns. Jeremiah Sullivan, one of the few miners who would later speak openly about this period, described the atmosphere in a 1966 interview with the Tennessee Historical Commission. "It wasn't just the cold or the hunger or the long hours that wore on us that winter. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. Men would come up from the deep shafts acting strange, jumpy one minute, eerily calm the next. Some refused to go back down, even knowing they'd lose their jobs. We started hearing stories about a new tunnel they'd found, one that wasn't on any of the maps. The company men sealed it up right quick, but not before some of the fellows heard things coming from inside it." A particularly telling entry in Dr. Blackwood's medical journal, dated February 27, 1911, reads, "Examined Samuel Reeves today. Third miner this month to report identical symptoms, persistent headaches, visual disturbances, and what he describes as a feeling of being watched. Physical examination reveals nothing unusual. beginning to wonder if some sort of coal gas might be present in the lower levels of Shaft 7. Have advised Mr. Wilcox to have the area tested, though he seems dismissive of these concerns. What Dr. Blackwood didn't know, but what would later be revealed through Frederick Wilcox's private correspondence, uncovered in 1975, was that Wilcox had indeed ordered tests of the air quality in Shaft 7. A letter dated March 1, 1911, from the Pittsburgh Mining Consultancy reports, air samples show normal composition with no toxic gases present in significant quantities. However, we note the unusual acoustic properties of the shaft in question. Our engineer reports that certain frequencies appear to be amplified by the natural rock formations, creating standing wave patterns of remarkable stability. This phenomenon might account for the auditory disturbances reported by your workers. We recommend either reinforcing the shaft walls with sound-dampening materials or abandoning this section entirely. Wilcox's response, preserved as a draft in his papers, is particularly revealing. Your findings confirm Simmons's theory regarding the unique acoustic properties of the limestone formations. Please forward all testing equipment as requested and maintain strict confidentiality regarding your observations. The potential applications extend far beyond mining safety. By March, as the snow began to thaw and the roads cleared, the situation in Wilder had reached a breaking point. A labor strike seemed imminent. The miners, pushed to their limits by harsh conditions and unexplained events, had begun organizing secret meetings. It was during this time that local residents reported strange occurrences at the Simmons property, lights burning until dawn, the sound of hammering late into the night. Margaret Simmons, once a fixture at community gatherings, hadn't been seen in public for weeks. Cordelia Massey, who served as the town's postmistress for over 30 years, recalled in a 1956 interview, Margaret had stopped collecting their mail in early February. When I saw Thomas, I asked after her health. He told me she was suffering from a nervous condition and needed rest. There was something in his manner that troubled me, a coldness in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. I remember thinking it odd that a man so concerned with his wife's health would look almost pleased when speaking of her illness. Another neighbor, Edith Carpenter, reported seeing Thomas carrying what appeared to be heavy medical equipment into the house late at night. It was near midnight, and I was up with my colicky baby, she recalled in a statement given to Eleanora Hayes in 1958. I saw Mr. Simmons struggling with a large brass contraption. It looked something like a phonograph horn, but much larger, with all manner of tubes and gauges attached to it. When he saw me watching from my window, he hurriedly covered it with a blanket. The next morning, he brought over a jar of honey and made a peculiar point of mentioning how soundly he and Mrs. Simmons had slept. On the morning of March 17, 1911, Thomas Simmons arrived at the mine office reportedly looking haggard and unwashed. According to statements given by Clerk Howard Jenkins to the Cumberland County Historical Society in 1958, Simmons demanded a private meeting with owner Frederick Wilcox. The two men were locked in Wilcox's office for over 2 hours. When they emerged, witnesses described both men as pale and visibly shaken. That same afternoon, Wilcox unexpectedly announced generous concessions to the miners' demands, a 20% wage increase, reduced hours, and lower prices at the company store. The sudden reversal of the company's labor policies caught everyone by surprise. The miners, while relieved to have their demands met without a strike, were nevertheless suspicious of the timing. Adding to the mystery was Wilcox's unprecedented decision to close the mine entirely for 3 days, citing necessary infrastructure repairs. During this closure, several witnesses reported seeing company wagons transporting large tarpaulin-covered objects from the main shaft to an unknown destination in the dead of night. Jenkins, who had worked for the mining company for over 15 years by that point, would later confide to his daughter that he had overheard fragments of the heated conversation between Simmons and Wilcox. It wasn't about the miners or their conditions, he reportedly said. Simmons kept saying, "It's evolving beyond our control, and the parameters have been exceeded." Wilcox responded at one point, "For God's sake, man, shut it down, then." To which Simmons replied, "It's far too late for that." What truly transpired during that private meeting remains one of the central mysteries of the case. However, a fragment of what might have been discussed was discovered in 2010 when renovation workers at the old company headquarters found a dictation cylinder that had fallen behind a cabinet. When played on restored equipment, It contained approximately 2 minutes of a conversation between two men identified by audio experts as likely being Simmons and Wilcox. The recording, partially degraded, includes the following exchange. Simmons * frequency has stabilized at 18.9 Hz. The effect is consistent across all test subjects. Wilcox *, and you're certain this is what's causing the phenomena in Shaft 7. Simmons * not causing, Frederick, revealing. The frequency acts as a sort of perceptual gateway. It allows the human mind to perceive what is already there but normally filtered out by our sensory limitations. Wilcox *, those miners weren't just hallucinating, then. Simmons * quite the opposite. They were experiencing a heightened state of perception. The question is not what they were seeing, but what is always there, watching us, just beyond the threshold of normal awareness. The recording ends abruptly at this point. Attempts to authenticate it have yielded inconclusive results, though the Tennessee State Archives maintains it in their collection of Wilder Mining Company artifacts. 3 days later, Thomas Simmons didn't report to work. When a colleague was sent to check on him, he found the Simmons homestead empty. No signs of struggle, no notes left behind. The stove was cold. 2 plates with half-eaten breakfast sat on the kitchen table, now covered in a thin layer of dust. In the main bedroom, the bed was made. Clothes were neatly hung in the wardrobe, and Margaret's hairbrush still had strands of her dark hair entwined in its bristles. The colleague, William Hargrove, later described finding one additional detail that never made it into the official report: a small leather notebook open on Thomas's desk with a single line written in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting. "They're coming through now. God help us." The disappearance caused little initial concern. Many assumed the couple had simply relocated, perhaps to Nashville or Knoxville, where opportunities were more plentiful. Yet no one recalled seeing them leave. No wagons or carriages were hired. Their personal belongings remained untouched. It was as if they had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. An entry in the Wilder Town Registry dated March 25, 1911, notes simply, "Simmons property vacant. T. Simmons employment terminated by mutual agreement." According to F. Wilcox. No further official mention of the couple appears in any public records for several months. It would later emerge through documents uncovered during a 1957 tax audit that Frederick Wilcox had quietly purchased the Simmons property on March 22, 1911, just 2 days after their disappearance, for a sum considerably above its market value. The transaction was processed through a Nashville law firm with no local connections, effectively obscuring the change in ownership from community knowledge. In the days following the Simmons disappearance, miners reported that Shaft 7, the site of the previous unusual occurrences, had been completely sealed off with concrete and heavy timbers. A new company policy strictly prohibited any discussion of that section of the mine, with termination stated as the consequence for violations. The missing miners were never mentioned again in any official capacity. A curious entry in Frederick Wilcox's personal ledger, discovered during the 1957 audit, shows a payment of $5,000, equivalent to over $130,000 in today's currency, to a Dr. Elliot Warburton of the Institute for Advanced Acoustic Research, an organization that, according to subsequent investigations, never existed in any official capacity. The payment is dated March 21, 1911, just 1 day after the Simmons disappearance. Weeks passed, and the improved working conditions at the mine mollified the workers enough that few questions were asked about the former foreman's whereabouts. Frederick Wilcox, when questioned, merely stated that Thomas had tendered his resignation and was seeking opportunities elsewhere. The matter might have been forgotten entirely if not for what happened on the night of April 30, 1911. A tremendous storm swept through the Cumberland Plateau that evening. Lightning struck the abandoned Simmons property, igniting a fire in the eastern wing of the house. Volunteer firefighters from Wilder managed to contain the blaze before it consumed the entire structure, but not before significant damage had been done to the rear portion of the home. It was during the cleanup the following morning that the first troubling discovery was made. Behind a false wall in what had once been a pantry, firefighters discovered a hidden doorway leading to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. According to the official report filed by Fire Captain William Donnelly, none of the men present had been aware of the existence of this subterranean space. Armed with lanterns, Donnelly and 2 volunteers descended the stairs. What they found was described in deliberately vague terms in the official record. A room containing items of a disturbing nature was the extent of the documentation. However, personal journals kept by Donnelly, discovered after his death in 1937, painted a far more unsettling picture. The hidden basement contained a table bolted to the floor with leather restraints attached to each corner. The walls were lined with crude shelves holding jars of unidentifiable substances. A desk in the corner held a leather-bound journal, allegedly belonging to Thomas Simmons, filled with entries dating back to 1902. Donnelly's journal entry for May 1, 1911, reads, "I have instructed the men who accompanied me to speak nothing of what we witnessed. Some things are best left buried." The contents of Simmons's journal suggest a man whose mind had long since departed from the shores of sanity. References to the purification process and vessels of the divine experiment appear repeatedly. Most disturbing were the detailed sketches of human anatomy with annotations that I dare not describe even in this private account. What Donnelly's public account omitted, but his private journal revealed, was the discovery of what appeared to be a sophisticated recording apparatus in one corner of the hidden room. The device, advanced for its time, consisted of a modified phonograph with additional components of unknown purpose. Attached to it was a brass plate engraved with the words, "Harmonics of the Threshold." Several dozen wax recording cylinders were neatly arranged on a nearby shelf, each labeled with only a date and a number. Donnelly apparently removed one of these cylinders before reporting the discovery to authorities. His journal entry continues, "I have brought cylinder 17 home with me. God forgive me for this theft, but something compels me to understand what drove Simmons to create such a place beneath his respectable home. Tonight, when the house is quiet, I shall listen to what he recorded." The next entry, dated May 2, 1911, consists of only a single line, "I will destroy the cylinder at first light." Some sounds were never meant for human ears. Donnelly's wife, Martha, would later report to their son that on the night of May 1, her husband locked himself in his study with the mysterious cylinder and what she presumed was a phonograph borrowed from a neighbor. Shortly after midnight, she was awakened by a scream followed by the sound of breaking glass. When she rushed to the study, she found her husband sitting motionless at his desk, staring at the wall. The phonograph lay in pieces on the floor. When she spoke to him, he didn't respond for several minutes and then asked, "Did you hear them, too?" He refused to explain what he meant and forbade her from ever mentioning the incident again. Donnelly would serve as fire captain for another 26 years, but according to family members, he was never quite the same after that night. He developed an intense fear of the dark, sleeping only during daylight hours when possible and keeping multiple lamps burning throughout the night. He refused to enter caves or mines and reportedly stuffed cotton in his ears during thunderstorms, claiming certain sounds in the thunder might carry messages. Within days, the fire-damaged Simmons property was demolished by order of Frederick Wilcox, who had apparently purchased the deed shortly after the couple's disappearance. The rubble was cleared and the foundation was filled in with soil and gravel. A small park was established on the site, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill toward the mining community. During the demolition, according to an account provided by laborer Joseph Winters in a 1953 interview, workers uncovered what appeared to be a network of pipes extending from the hidden basement room into the surrounding soil. They weren't normal water or gas pipes, Winters recalled. They were made of some kind of copper alloy, and they had these strange bulbous chambers at irregular intervals. Mr. Wilcox had us remove them all and load them onto a company wagon. Never said where they were taking them, but he was mighty particular that we find every last one. One of these pipes, reportedly broken off during extraction, was secretly kept by Winters as a curiosity. In 1964, his grandson donated it to the Tennessee State Museum, where metallurgical analysis revealed it to be made of an unusual copper-nickel alloy with acoustic properties unlike standard plumbing materials. Most notable was its interior design, which featured a spiral pattern etched into the metal at precise intervals, a design that acoustic engineers concluded would selectively amplify certain sound frequencies while dampening others. For nearly 2 decades, the events surrounding the Simmons disappearance faded from public memory. Wilder continued to operate as a coal mining town, though production gradually decreased as more accessible seams were exhausted. By the late 1920s, many of the original miners had moved on, taking with them the oral history of those strange days in 1911. Yet subtle changes in the community were noted by outsiders. A 1922 report by a traveling public health physician noted that Wilder residents showed an unusually high incidence of melancholic disposition and nervousness. Local church attendance declined sharply. The school reported increasing difficulty maintaining student focus. By 1925, the once thriving community had diminished to less than half its former population, despite the continued operation of the mines. Frederick Wilcox sold his controlling interest in the Tennessee Consolidated Coal Company in 1921 and relocated to Boston, where he established the Wilcox Foundation for Acoustic Research. The foundation's official mission was advancing the understanding of sound and its applications in architectural and medical contexts. However, according to financial records uncovered in the 1980s, much of its funding went toward grants to researchers studying infrasonic influences on neurological states and acoustic gateways to altered perception. It wasn't until 1929 that the case resurfaced in an unexpected way. A geology student from Vanderbilt University, Robert Thornton, was conducting research on the unique limestone formations of the Cumberland Plateau. While exploring an unmarked cave system approximately 3 miles east of Wilder, Thornton made a startling discovery. Deep within the cavern, in a chamber that showed signs of human modification, he found evidence of habitation. Kerosene lamps, preserved food supplies, and basic furniture suggested someone had lived, or at least spent significant time, in this remote location. Most notably, Thornton recovered a metal box containing personal effects, a pocket watch inscribed with the initials T.S., a woman's wedding band, and several pages of handwritten notes. The notes, partially damaged by moisture, contained fragmented thoughts that Thornton later connected to Thomas Simmons after researching local history. References to the failure of the experiment at home, and the necessity of continuing my work in isolation, painted a picture of a man who had deliberately gone into hiding. Thornton's field journal, preserved in the Vanderbilt University archives, contains detailed sketches of the cave chamber and its modifications. Most striking were his drawings of unusual markings carved into the cave walls, geometric patterns of remarkable precision that Thornton noted appeared to have been created with scientific instruments rather than crude tools. He described one section of the wall as covered in mathematical equations and what appear to be acoustic formulas, though their purpose eludes me. In a particularly haunting passage, Thornton wrote, "The patterns seem designed to create specific resonance patterns when sound waves interact with them. Most curious is that when I whistle a sustained note near certain configurations, the returning echo seems to contain harmonics not present in the original sound, as if the patterns themselves are adding frequencies to the acoustic environment." In the deepest part of the modified chamber, Thornton discovered what he described as a listening post of some kind. His notes describe a chair positioned in front of a natural chimney in the rock, modified with the same copper alloy pipes found at the Simmons house. The pipes converged at a contraption positioned at ear height to someone seated in the chair. Thornton's journal entry reads, "The entire apparatus appears designed to channel, or perhaps amplify, sounds from deep within the cave system." But what sounds could be of such interest as to warrant this elaborate setup in such an inhospitable location? What Thornton found most disturbing, according to his journal, was not the equipment itself, but the state in which he found it. The chair shows signs of having been occupied recently, within days, not years. The lantern contained oil. Food supplies are not deteriorated, yet I have encountered no one in 3 days of exploration. If someone is living in these caves, they are either deeper within the system than I have ventured, or they have vacated temporarily, perhaps aware of my presence. Thornton reported his findings to local authorities. But by 1929, few people remained in the area who remembered the Simmons case. His discovery was relegated to a brief mention in the Nashville Tennessean and filed away in the county records office. Thornton himself continued his academic career, eventually becoming a professor of geology at the University of Tennessee. In a 1952 interview for an academic journal, he reflected on the experience. "I have explored caves across 5 continents, but nothing has ever affected me as profoundly as what I found in that Tennessee cavern. There was something in the atmosphere, a sense of wrongness that I've never been able to adequately describe. Science doesn't have a vocabulary for that kind of feeling." What Thornton did not include in his official reports, but confided to a colleague, according to correspondence preserved in the university archives, was that he had spent one night in the modified chamber out of scientific curiosity. His letter, dated August 12, 1929, states, "I regret to inform you that I will be taking a leave of absence from our planned expedition to the Blue Ridge Formations. My experience in the Cumberland site has left me with a persistent auditory disturbance that makes field work impossible at present. The university physician diagnoses it as tinnitus, but no medical explanation accounts for the distinct patterns I perceive in the noise, almost like a code or language just beyond the threshold of comprehension." In a follow-up letter dated September 3, 1929, Thornton wrote, "The sounds continue unabated. I find myself unconsciously pressing my ear to walls, particularly in quiet rooms, as if expecting to hear something responding from the other side. Most troubling is that I've begun to understand fragments of what I'm hearing, not in any conventional linguistic sense, but as concepts that form directly in my mind. They are asking questions about us, about our world. They want to know if we're ready." Thornton would go on to make significant contributions to the field of geology, but colleagues noted that he never returned to cave exploration and refused to discuss his Tennessee findings in his later years. His personal papers, donated to Vanderbilt after his death in 1967, included a sealed envelope labeled Wilder Cave, Personal. University archivists report that this envelope disappeared from their collection sometime in the early 1970s. No investigation into its removal was ever conducted. The case might have remained closed if not for the efforts of investigative journalist Eleanora Hayes in the late 1950s. While researching a series of articles on Appalachian mining communities, Hayes stumbled upon references to the Simmons disappearance. Intrigued, she began to piece together the fragmented narrative through county records, newspaper archives, and interviews with elderly residents who still remembered those days. What Hayes uncovered suggested a conspiracy of silence that had effectively buried the truth for nearly 5 decades. According to her notes, published posthumously in 1968, she managed to locate an individual who claimed to have worked as a house servant for the Wilcox family in 1911. This source, identified only as M.J., provided a troubling account of the relationship between Thomas Simmons and Frederick Wilcox. They weren't just business associates, M.J. reportedly told Hayes. They were involved in something else. Something Mr. Wilcox called the research. I overheard them late one night in Mr. Wilcox's study. They spoke of advancing human understanding and breaking the limitations of consciousness. Mr. Simmons seemed to be the one with the knowledge, but Mr. Wilcox provided the resources and protection. M.J. also described strange deliveries to the Wilcox estate in the months preceding the Simmons disappearance. Large wooden crates would arrive by private wagon, always after dark. The men would unload them directly into the cellar through the exterior doors. Once I glimpsed the contents of a smaller package, glass tubes and brass fittings, like something from a scientific laboratory. When I asked about them, Mr. Wilcox dismissed me for the day. The next morning, he increased my wages by 20% without explanation. Perhaps most disturbing was M.J.'s account of the changes in Wilcox's behavior following the Simmons disappearance. He became obsessed with silence. Had the entire mansion retrofitted with cork insulation between the walls. No clocks were allowed to chime. He would sit for hours in his study with a strange brass device held to his ear like a doctor's stethoscope, but connected to a box with dials. Sometimes he would suddenly write furiously in his notebook, as if taking dictation. Once I entered the room unexpectedly, and he was speaking to an empty chair, nodding and responding to questions I couldn't hear. Hayes's investigation led her to the discovery of financial records showing that between 1902 and 1911, Frederick Wilcox had made substantial payments to medical supply companies in Philadelphia and Chicago. These companies specialized in equipment typically used by teaching hospitals and research institutions. Why such items would be shipped to a remote mining town in Tennessee remained unexplained. Perhaps most disturbing was Hayes's discovery of death certificates for 3 miners who had reportedly left Wilder for other opportunities in early 1911. All 3 certificates had been filed in counties at least 100 miles from Wilder. All listed natural causes despite the men being under 40 years of age, and all had been signed by different physicians who, upon later investigation, could not be verified as ever having practiced medicine in those counties. In the summer of 1959, Hayes made a significant breakthrough. Through persistent research, she located the whereabouts of Margaret Simmons's younger sister, Constance Wheeler, who was living in a boarding house in Knoxville. Though elderly and in poor health, Wheeler agreed to an interview. What she revealed cast the entire case in a new and disturbing light. According to Wheeler, her sister's marriage to Thomas Simmons had been a happy one initially. Thomas had been a medical student at Vanderbilt University but had abandoned his studies after becoming fascinated with what he called the frontiers of human consciousness. Unable to pursue his interests within the confines of traditional medicine, he had taken the position at the Wilder Mine, where he met Frederick Wilcox, a man who shared his unorthodox interests. Thomas believed that the human mind functioned like a receiver, Wheeler explained to Hayes. He thought our normal perception filtered out vast portions of reality to make existence comprehensible. His research focused on finding ways to temporarily disable those filters to allow the mind to perceive what he called the fuller spectrum of existence. He was particularly interested in sound as a gateway. He believed certain acoustic frequencies could attune the mind to aspects of reality that normally remain imperceptible. Wheeler claimed that in the years leading up to 1911, Margaret had become increasingly concerned about her husband's activities. In letters to her sister, she described strange sounds coming from the basement at night and Thomas's growing obsession with testing the thresholds of perception. Most troublingly, she mentioned visitors who arrived under cover of darkness, men with academic credentials, who engaged in lengthy discussions with Thomas behind closed doors. Wheeler shared with Hayes fragments of letters she had received from Margaret between 1908 and 1911. In one dated October 1908, Margaret wrote, "Thomas speaks constantly of his breakthrough, though he shares little of the specifics with me. He says it's for my protection. What troubles me most is the change in him. He barely sleeps, and when he does, he wakes shouting about the space between sounds. Last night, I found him in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, pressing his ear against the wall and writing furiously in his notebook." A letter from July 1909 reads, "The men from the university visited again. They spoke with Thomas for hours in his study. When they left, one of them looked so pale, I thought he might faint on our porch. Thomas was elated afterward. He said they had finally begun to understand the implications of his work. He mentioned something about acoustic gateways and the mathematics of liminality. I pretend to understand to keep him talking, but his ideas have moved beyond my comprehension." In a particularly troubling letter from December 1910, Margaret wrote, "Thomas has convinced me to participate in what he calls controlled exposure. He has prepared a room in the basement where he claims the conditions are ideal for perception of the phenomenon he's been studying. I have agreed primarily to ease his growing paranoia that I don't believe in his work. The process involves sitting in complete darkness while wearing a device he has constructed that covers the ears and eyes. I am to report anything I perceive that seems unusual. Thus far, I've experienced nothing beyond the expected sensations of sensory deprivation, mild disorientation, increased awareness of my own heartbeat, and occasionally phantom sounds that I recognize as creations of my own mind seeking stimulation." Thomas seems disappointed, but assures me that with repeated sessions, my perception will attune to what he calls the frequency. The last letter Wheeler received from her sister was dated March 15, 1911, just days before the couple's disappearance. It contained a single disturbing sentence, "If anything should happen to me, know that it began the night Thomas discovered the effects of isolation on the human mind." Wheeler also revealed to Hayes that she had attempted to visit Wilder after receiving no further correspondence from her sister. "I arrived in late April only to find their house damaged by fire and being demolished. When I asked in town, people avoided my questions. Mr. Wilcox agreed to meet with me briefly. He ended our meeting abruptly, but not before offering me a considerable sum to help with my travels home. I refused the money, and that evening the sheriff personally escorted me to the train station, claiming there had been incidents of harassment toward outsiders." What Wheeler had not shared with Hayes, but later confided to her nephew, according to a family account recorded in 1972, was that during her brief stay in Wilder, she had experienced a series of disturbing auditory phenomena. He claimed Thomas and Margaret had moved to Colorado for Margaret's health, but could provide no forwarding address. "When I mentioned my sister's troubling final letter, something changed in his manner. At night, in my room at the boarding house, I would hear what sounded like my sister's voice, though the words were indistinct. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. When I pressed my ear against the plaster, the voice became clearer. But what I heard made no sense, Margaret reciting strings of numbers and unfamiliar terms, as if reading from a technical document. On my final night in town, the voice changed. It spoke directly to me, using my childhood nickname that only Margaret knew. It said, "Connie, we found a door, but it opens both ways." Hayes attempted to pursue this lead further, but her investigation came to an abrupt end. In October 1959, while driving to meet with a former miner who claimed to have information about secret tunnels beneath the Wilder mines, her car veered off a mountain road. The crash was ruled an accident, though some locals noted the lack of skid marks at the scene. Hayes's notes and research materials, which she reportedly kept with her at all times, were never recovered. A curious footnote to Hayes's death emerged 15 years later when a retired Tennessee state trooper, William Carver, came forward with an alternative account. In a sworn affidavit, Carver claimed he had been part of the emergency response team at Hayes's accident. There was no damage to the steering components of her vehicle as the official report claimed, his statement read. Moreover, her research materials were not missing. They were removed from the scene by men identifying themselves as federal agents before the local sheriff even arrived. When I questioned this, my supervisor informed